Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Discussion Politics, where we talk about many different things, including topics revolving around politics mainly. I'm here with Connor Clark. Hey, Connor, how's it going?
I'm well. Had a great weekend. Hope you did the same. Thanks for having me back.
I had a great weekend. It was full of fun activities. So let's just dive into some of the topics we have here. And one of them seems to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964. Uh, what, what was the main goal or objective of that particular bill, and what was it setting to accomplish? Obviously, civil rights means increased rights for minority populations, giving them better opportunities to succeed, right? So, what was the positives that came from that?
Yeah, you won't see a lot of people arguing for the negatives of it these days.
Well, we want to know the positives of it, not the negatives. We don't want the negatives. We want the positives.
Of course. Well, I would start with the context that, in my opinion, and I'm repeating an argument I've heard before, that most of history is quite racist, or at least very ethnocentric. And the modern progress we've seen isn't really the natural arc of history bending towards justice. I know that sounds cynical. It's really backlash to the Nazis. Martin Luther King did, in his time, when he was criticized for using civil disobedience, did say, hey, everything Hitler did was law and order. It was legal. The tactics of oppression he was using. So there was an emphasis on peaceful and civil disobedience. And as the backlash to the Nazis grew and more of their atrocities came out, Americans included, and a lot of populations around the world had to start taking a harder look at themselves and seeing how their own policies and versions of segregation and apartheid were mirroring that, or seeming at least like Nazi light. There's no doubt that over the 1950s, even before King was strongly on the scene, there had been a litany of various activists, preachers. We think of Rosa Parks. She actually, I think she was on the scene before Dr. King was. She had been an activist. She was not just some nice little old granny who turned defiant one day. She had been involved in different boycotts and protests, and it was a deliberate tactical move on her part on that day in December 1st, 1955, where she deliberately sat in a whites-only seat and refused to give it up. And that led to different boycotts. We'd had the Brown versus Board of Education, which started the desegregation of schools. And then I guess we moved into the 1960s. I won't go through the whole litany of events. For one thing, I've taken too many notes on them and learned just a lot preparing for this. I will jump to something of the turning point. By the time Dr. King was on the scene, there were many other charismatic and intelligent doctors, lawyers, preachers. He was kind of in the right place at the right time, is what I gather, to become an important figurehead. And what I see is that around May, he had been jailed in one of his acts of civil disobedience, I guess in April, and there were continuing protests around that. It evolved into what was called the Children's Crusade. So it was focused on child poverty in Black communities and why segregation, Jim Crow was largely to blame for that. And that was when Bull Connor showed up. No relation, thank goodness. And fire hoses, dogs, police nightsticks, all sorts of nasty tactics. And we're seeing the modern media create headwaves. Create waves and headwinds for the plight of these civil rights activists. And because it made national and even international news in ways I think can be compared to the backlash against George Floyd's death. I think I'm comfortable saying murder at this point now that we have a verdict. But the backlash to state overreach, big government, and at least from my perspective, was for JFK to be the first president to clearly step out and stake his political capital on calling for a civil rights bill. So then over the summer, communities, white, black, immigrant, international activists, they're saying, yeah, U.S. should go ahead and do this. And the case that JFK had been making for at least a few years was that not only are we dealing with the legacy of World War II, we're also staking our claim as Americans as defenders of freedom throughout the world and of decolonization. So the U.S. had browbeaten the U.K. and France and others. Even at the same time, the U.S. is starting to pick up where France left off in Vietnam, but that's still on the down low. Eisenhower, some credit to him for enforcing Brown versus Board of Education as well. But JFK was really the first one to stake his potential reelection on it. And so after he does that on June 11th, 63, the rest of the summer up until August 28th, 63 is when we get to MLK giving his speech. It was a historical game changer in our history books. It wasn't so clear at the time, and it was really it wasn't clear at the time that JFK's death was anywhere around the corner. I mean, nobody assumed it was, and it wasn't clear that this would lead directly to the 64 Civil Rights Act, that it would even be in 64. A lot of people wanted it signed now, but LBJ, the classical politician, quintessential backslapper and glad handler, was able to make a very convincing case despite not being nearly as charismatic as JFK or nearly as integrated with the civil rights movement as JFK had been, because he'd been a Southern Democrat, a Dixiecrat, although very still supportive and warm to FDR's policies when he got his start. LBJ was ready to pounce and realize that this is our chance to tout it to Congress, the nation, the world, saying, hey, this is what JFK wanted. We should pass this Civil Rights Act. And within several months, it was done. What was really interesting was that there was a Dixiecrat from Virginia who tried to slip a poison pill in there to make it less popular. He tried to slip in an amendment saying, oh, well, this discrimination based on race, well, we shouldn't do it on sex either. And a lot of Republicans and Democrats around the country, but not in the South. I think 7 or 8 signed on from the South, but there was bipartisan, head nodding saying, okay. So a lot of the key tenets of what the Civil Rights Act actually accomplished, and I want to make sure I get my notes right here. We should see that it's prohibiting state and local governments from denying access to public facilities like swimming pools based on race and color, immigrant or national origin. It finalizes that desegregation of public schools. And it builds upon the Civil Rights Commission, again, created under the Eisenhower administration in 57, and it aims to stop employment discrimination on these bases of race and color and sex. And then also same for the federal government. If you're an agency or you're contracted by a federal agency to provide services, you're bound to abide by these rules. And then it criminalizes any discrimination against individuals when it comes to marriage. So that solidified Loving versus Virginia in legislation, not just a judicial ruling. And ultimately, it's I think one important thing that is not overlooked is that it allows the federal government to move civil rights cases out of state courts if there's a reasonable belief that these judges or juries are going to be biased. Now, it wasn't really until 1965, or in fact, it just was not until 65 that we get the Voting Rights Act that implemented a lot more of these underlying factors. There was the belief that, you can pass all these, but they could also be repealed. So we're going to have to pass the Voting Rights Act to give Black populations and sympathetic white and Latino and immigrant, all of the above populations, the chance to uphold these. And that was a strategic factor. Of course, it was seen as a positive good in and of itself to expand the voting rights. And it did enable the federal government to reach out and target certain states and counties and saying, hey, we know your history, we know your politics, we're seeing bad behavior here, and we're going to impose other solutions. And I think that that's basically where we get bans on racial gerrymanders. And then we've seen in 2013 that a lot of that has been questioned by the Supreme Court and overturned, because back then the majority opinion was that, well, this is not really as big a concern anymore. There's the New South, it's dynamic, it's, you know, consumer friendly, so they're not going to alienate Black customers. Okay, you know, and that's still very controversial. The current administration wants to undo that. As it is, it seems, with the SCOTUS having a even more conservative majority these days, it doesn't look like they're going to overturn their own 2013 ruling. But the Democratic Congress is also pretty on board with saying, we don't like this. We would like to reinstate parts of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is important to not confuse with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I do think it's important to see them as two sides of a similar coin, while distinguishing which act did what, because neither was a guarantee. And it did take the re-election of Johnson to get to the 65 Voting Rights Act.
There are some rumors of LBJ plotting the assassination of JFK. I know and I recognize very deeply that these are conspiracy theories. People have, posted things like this around the web, and mostly they are fiction and not factual. Mm-hmm. And I just want to get your take on whether you think those conspiracies about the assassination are factual, based in reality, or possibly made up fiction, false stories that people just thought about.
Right. Well, I will admit, when I was 14 and I was reading about this and hearing about conspiracy theories, Johnson was the first suspect on my list. One of his predecessors as vice president, Harry Truman, said that the vice presidency wasn't worth a warm bucket of piss. So, yeah, and it's only in recent years that the vice presidency has become a more high profile and busy and interesting job, where an ambitious politician can accrue power and put themselves a step closer to being elected president in their own right. That said, I think Johnson was, again, this is, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, but I think it would have been very hard for a sitting vice president to pull off. We did get the Warren Commission out of it. It does depend upon how much trust you have in institutions, but because Lee Harvey Oswald was assassinated himself before he could be fully tried and fully interrogated, I guess it was, a lot of the truth died with him. I know the Soviets were panicking quite a lot when they heard about it. What is interesting is I think we can debunk the idea that the Soviets had anything to do with it. They were running around saying, oh my God, did some rogue KGB officer put Oswald up this? Oswald had lived in Minsk for a while, as did I. And there was a lot of running around seeing if they'd have to burn files or just arrest people or anything to avoid a nuclear escalation. Because again, they had just gotten out of the Cuban Missile Crisis a year earlier. So I think there's enough evidence of genuine panic in the Soviet ranks. We can debunk that. As for Johnson, who might have had more access, I just get the sense that even though he was a strategic pick, so Kennedy could win Texas, from what I've read of his personality, he didn't have that sort of conspiratorial and ruthless streak. Robert Caro has done a pretty good biography of LBJ. And I mean, again, I'm inclined to trust the Warren Commission, which says it was a lone crazed gunman who did it. And I'm inclined to trust Robert Caro, who just doesn't portray LBJ in that conspiratorial light. Again, we're going to get declassified documents on the Kennedy assassination at some point, I believe. They've been stored up for years, but I would be skeptical, very skeptical of any newfangled piece of evidence that supposedly blows the whole lid off it, unless it is empirically tied to other factors that set off other light bulbs and suddenly other things start making sense as well. You know, there's accusations the Castros were behind it, the mafia. I mean, I would believe the mafia would have more interest in sniping JFK than LBJ, and more means to do so, because, you know, vice presidency, you're still under a lot of public scrutiny.
So you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis with Cuba. Looking at that from a broader perspective from the Cold War, like let's take a step back and see the Cold War was from 1945. It began in 1945 and it ended in 1981, if I recall correctly. I may be incorrect about that fact, but I think that's right.
I'm checking as 91.
Viewing the Cuban Missile Crisis inside of that time frame, we understand the Russians were the big players and the Americans were the other big players that were having a conflict during this Cold War period. Are the Cubans even a part of that particular history, or are they just some sort of pawn that the Russians used to attack the Americans from because of the Bay of Pigs invasion that happened in 1963 from the orders of JFK?
Right. Interestingly,
my question is, how do you think the Russians played a role in that? Because I'm sure they did. Well, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure that there is some small impact in how the Russians used Cuba as a pawn to attack the United States.
Sure.
What are your thoughts?
I would think of it in that the Soviets were seeing Cuba through a similar lens as the US had seen Greece and Turkey, as a bulwark against communism right on the Soviets' doorstep to keep them nervous and preoccupied. And it was a place where the US had started putting nuclear missiles inside Turkey. Incirlik Air Base, I think, is the buzz term for that. And the Soviets were quite happy to see and then aid the rise of Castro, who overthrew Batista, and which in turn spawned a lot of the Cuban exile and diaspora population we now see, and I think culturally and economically benefit from in mostly Florida. And when the Soviets were starting to know more about these missiles in Turkey, well, they said, you know, we could put some missiles in Cuba, see how they like it, see if we can use this as a bargaining chip or just counter them, at least match them. What's interesting is JFK did campaign on this. Oh, we've got a missile gap. We're way behind the Soviets. Actually, it was pretty close to parity, not parity, but parity, about strategic equality. And if anything, the US was in some measures ahead in the arms race. So the Soviets welcomed the rise of Castro, and JFK, you know, he does take quite a bit of historical flack for sending in the Bay of Pigs invaders and attempted counter coup, and then pulling back U.S. air support at the last minute. I mean, it's you know, I guess it's fairly conventional knowledge in political military affairs that if you're going to go in, you go in for a good reason, and then you have your allies back. If you're going to pull the air support, don't send in the ground guys at all. So that definitely did, I think it signaled to Khrushchev that there was a certain weakness and lack of resolve in either JFK personally or the American system. So Soviets rolled the gamble. They rolled the dice on a gamble that they could get away with this. And when the US started picking up with spy planes their missiles in Cuba, there were various options, and do nothing was one of them presented by the State Department, because Soviet missiles able to target the US were nothing new. And you can go through the history and read about the blockade and the leverage, and a very close call where a Soviet sailor who had been aboard the defective K-19 submarine that had a nuclear meltdown years before, he was very hard. He had a very hard or a very clear, weighty memory of the effects of that on his fellow sailors. And he belayed or vetoed or prevented orders to launch Soviet nuclear missiles out of a submarine that he was later serving on, where they had a panic and thought the Americans were attacking. So that was a close call. And ultimately, we have the strategic outcome where the U.S. does agree to withdraw missiles from Turkey, but they're going to do it on a slower time frame, and they won't admit it's part of the bargain. And JFK and his brother RFK, then an attorney general, but on some personal diplomacy, back channel diplomacy, agreed that, okay, we were going to wind down this program anyway. The missiles are aging; they're starting to become obsolete. So we'll backtrack over time, and they just didn't want to admit it to the world. And the Soviets, meanwhile, didn't have to really worry about protests or losing their next election if they backtracked from missiles being withdrawn from Cuba. There's plenty of Soviet pride they had to swallow, and I think this was one of the signals that while they could be aggressive actors and assertive and opportunist, they just didn't have the same fanaticism as the Nazis, which is something that had been part of containment strategy going back to George Kennan's long telegram and Article X, where he said they're both, great powers and they do want to dominate Europe, but there's a fundamental difference in their ways of thinking. And these Soviets are much more concerned with self-preservation, and we should account for that.
Fast forwarding into the future, President Biden has proposed the American Families Plan. Now, the American Families Plan delivers economic relief to millions of families. Obviously, it also gives free education, 2 years of education. So this is a huge win for Democrats recently. I would say many people agree with that notion as well. So what are your thoughts on the American Families Plan? Do you think it works? Do you think it's going to be effective in the future? What's your view on that?
Yeah, ambitious is an understatement. A lot of media figures are calling Biden the new FDR or calling him the anti-Reagan. There seems to be a lot of talk on how you're going to pay for it, which wasn't necessarily front and center in the 2017 tax cuts. And naturally, one of the ways that the Biden administration and the Dems in Congress do want to pay for it is by rolling back some of those tax expenditures, tax cuts from 2017. So we could see that the top marginal tax rate goes up from where it is about 37% to 39.6. It's hovered around there, over the past few decades. Bush cut it, Obama let it slide and let it expire. Those tax cuts expire and go back up. Trump brought it back down. And when I say each president, I also mean political operatives in their party, Congress, those who are ideologically and financially or fiscally aligned with them. So we shouldn't mistake that presidents can do this or make it happen at the stroke of a pen. Biden is dealing with a very slim majority, not just in the Senate, but also the House. And it looks likely that the census could cut into that even further. So you have to hand it to Schumer and Pelosi for running as tight ships as they do. I think their careers are both interesting to study as exercises in power and climbing the political ladder. And we'll see what they get done here. Still a lot of haggling to be done. As in terms of what seems to be popular, expanding the earned income tax credit. So that's one big plank of it. We'll get to the education in a moment, or at least I'll strive to. I'm not sure what the antonym of tapering is off the top of my head, but the earned income tax credit, or EITC, when you're at a low income or moderate income, it tapers up. I don't know if that makes sense. And then it plateaus as your income increases. And then it tapers back down as you start to move towards the middle class, and it's assumed you don't need it as much. Now, this may be a good point to show a graphic if you happen to have one that's working, but each arc is higher and higher for the number of kids you have. So you're at 1, 2, or 3. I think 3 is the maximum, and Biden is looking to expand where each arc is applicable. So there is some sort of redistributive aspect to this bill. It is actively taking tax money from those who are having capital gains, high incomes, real estate transactions, inheritance, and using that to make up for the gap in cutting taxes for other families in the form of the EITC. And we're seeing that's probably going to be pretty popular. I also think he's looking to pay for not just 2, but 4 years total of increased schooling. So there is going to be 2 extra years of community college or trade school, but also at the bottom end, tacking on 2 years of paid for pre-K and kindergarten. So I think there's going to be a couple of effects from those bills. I mean, I do think with the majority in Congress, as slim it is for the administration to be working it, we're going to see some sort of expanded spending in those. Whether he gets 4 out of 4 years, I don't know. If I did know, I would be working at a much higher place than I am now. So I guess I would only venture to say that expanded pre-K and kindergarten is likely to be a plank taken up by several states as well. And it seems that the odds that we see some sort of expanded benefit with some sort of increased taxes to pay for it, it seems like it's a coherent vision for what government should be doing to intervene in our lives and invest in the future. And I think there's some good scientific and psychological evidence that investing in students' educations early on in their lives, it does make a difference in their psychiatric or psychological development down the line. And I think it's meant to close some of the gaps we're seeing between children of color and white children, lower class children and upper class children. So there is that aspect of the goals as well. And then in terms of community college and trade school, I can see it providing competitive enough alternatives that fancier 4-year colleges suddenly have to reassess how competitive they are and ideally bring some of their high tuition rates down, lest they lose talented and skilled or aspiring to skilled students to better trade programs. And you can bet there's going to be a lot more trade apprenticeship and trade school apprenticeship and community college programs springing up if they know that this whole demand curve has increased for it through government subsidies. I don't really see the federal government setting up its own community colleges, but I do see there being some sort of expansion under this administration. The other plank that I know of between the tax credits and the expanded education is the American Families Plan's payments for daycare, or not just daycare, paid family leave. That's the other big one. Pardon me. Prenatal care, postnatal care. That's a big investment I think we can make that also pays dividends down the line. Again, if it's paid for and the people you're taxing from aren't really harmed for it except at the margins, that's something that has, hey, it's a coherent little L or big L liberal worldview. In fact, Biden did campaign on this, much to one of his controversies, when he was saying to a bunch of ritzy donors, and nothing's going to fundamentally change. He didn't mean nothing's going to fundamentally change in policy. He said, look, you're rich but liberal. I know you are worried about your taxes going up, but look, these tax hikes I'm campaigning on, and they're not going to fundamentally change your cushy lifestyle. So I noticed that there were a lot of Bernie-crats and Warren supporters who really despised that comment, but it was made in the context of Biden welcoming the well-to-do as a rich tax harvesting farm to pay for his ambitious programs elsewhere. So I think there are other countries we can look to for these sorts of programs and how well they can be run. How much wealth can be just redistributed through taxing policy, raising it on some, lowering it on others. That doesn't really do much to close the great deficit gap that we're seeing. So I personally would like to see some sort of rebalancing of taxes and spending that does actually close our deficits. But I will say for the earned income tax credit, I think the American Economists Association had a survey and 60% of economists said, yeah, this is a good investment. We're going to need it to prevent demographic decline, frankly. A lot of post-COVID families are doing family planning or lack thereof, meaning they're planning to not have families. And I think the US could be in a strategically and demographically and economically precarious position if we suddenly start sliding to 1.7 or 1.6 children per woman who chooses to have kids. And we're seeing a lot of that start to happen in China as well. In fact, it's been going on for a generation or two. So I do think it's good to look to the future and see how we can promote healthy children, a sustainable demographic rate, because once you start sliding into that, it's very hard to pull out of. I mean, people are expecting over this century that Japan will decline, not because of incredibly dysfunctional politics or some sort of geopolitical misadventurism, but simply because they're not going to be as prosperous a country as they have an aging population, a shrinking productive labor force. And I do think the US can help make up some of their gaps with immigration in ways the Japanese political system won't accept. And I do think there's also an important need to have some degree of demographic sustainability, at the very least, just for our entitlement and social safety net programs. I'm certainly not arguing that we just need to completely flood our deficits and get ourselves up to 500 million or something. That's I don't know if we'll ever hit 500 million, frankly, but I think some form of sustainability is key to great power status.
We've recently heard news about Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. He withdrew troops from Afghanistan, stemming from the Obama administration. We also there has been a lot of talk about Biden's first term in office being an extension of Obama's third term. And that's some sort of rumor that's going on as well. I mean, the media, it's spreading across different outlets, Washington Post, New York Times, all that. And also, people are comparing Obama and Biden as a team, and a friendship that lasts for a long time. And,
right.
and when history looks back at this particular friendship, it will be remembered as probably one of the greatest presidential friendships of all time. What's your take on the Obama comparison to Biden? Do you think there are any similarities, differences on those particular aspects?
Let's see. I mean, they are contrasts to JFK and LBJ, that's for sure. Or Truman and FDR. Truman had only been in office for a few months when FDR passed on. On that note, since you're bringing it up, I mean, it's yesterday's news, but my condolences to the first family, the Obamas, for the loss of their beloved beau, a very good boy who brought us many laughs and awes over the years. And I will say, there's been an interesting piece in Politico a few months back regarding the ways in which Obama and Biden were joined at the hip, or at least, and that was the image they actively sought to present publicly. I think if you go around trying to label Biden as Obama's third term as some sort of attack, a lot of moderates and liberals and even some socialists will say, yeah, okay, that's kind of what we were expecting. That's what we voted for. But Afghanistan is an interesting one. That is one where Biden is charting more his own course. He doesn't seem to be intent on pulling those last troops out of Afghanistan as quickly as Trump would have been had he won re-election. But the out before September 11th, it's setting a tight deadline, and I won't speak for those who serve there, but there seems to be a lot of high emotions running high on whether this is a good idea or bad idea, and a lot of interesting debate within the ranks of veterans. And I'm hesitant to form opinions on that myself and what's likely to happen next. without consulting more with their experiences. But from a 50,000 feet view, it seems quite likely the Taliban is going to take over Afghanistan. And we just saw yesterday, 30 people, mostly schoolgirls, were killed in a suicide bombing. They seem emboldened, more aggressive, ready to mount offensives, and keeping 2,500 troops, or maybe a 3,500 in Kabul and a few surrounding areas. I mean, it seems sustainable, at least compared to the 100,000 that were in there during the Obama presidency. I think Biden is increasingly skeptical of U.S. military involvement abroad. He's learned certain lessons from the Obama years. Critics might argue he overlearned them. Biden, I think, was one of the more skeptical figures of the Obama inner circle leading up to the intervention in Libya. I think I recall that much. And Afghanistan, again, ramping up troop presences there. I'm not sure where he stood on Syria, but he doesn't seem to be eager to jump back into any sort of peacekeeping or no-fly zone there. I think to any extent he is interested in redeploying U.S. military power or establishing deterrence or counterterrorism presences, it's in the Asia Pacific. And there's an argument saying, hey, we do need a small base in Afghanistan that's sustainable and only a few thousand troops, so that we can, we might have to keep them there 50 years, but it's not much different than what we've done in Japan, Korea, or Germany. Fareed Zakaria had an interesting point that there's a difference between doing that when the population wants you there to ward off a foe, and when you're trying to hold together a quasi-coalition government run mostly out of the capital city and doesn't control the countryside. So again, I have mixed feelings on it. I confess myself not fully informed on it. My great sympathies are with the families affected and all those who've served there. It seems that at the very least, the U.S. owes a debt of relocation and gratitude and to those who've helped as translators, local guides, interpreters, even bureaucrats who've tried to clean up corruption in the Afghan army, which is a beyond monumental task. And it's one of the reasons the U.S. seems to be interested in leaving them to their own devices. But there's a lot of risk involved here, and I don't have a good guess on what the long-term future holds. I think the expectation saying, oh well, there's a risk or there's a chance that they'll be able to stand on their own 2 feet and won't collapse. I think that's overrated. I mean, we've seen what happens before when various great powers and superpowers and empires have pulled out of Afghanistan. There is also it's not completely true that every foreign invader of Afghanistan has lost or been forced to pull out. But the big examples we think of, Alexander the Great, Britain, Soviet Union, those are looming large in some of the 50,000 foot commentary. And I do fear for the populations of Afghanistan and what it means for attracting future radicalized theocrats into the area and what they will be able to do either in Afghanistan or beyond their borders. Because, I think China is going to take an interest in what goes on there as well. I don't have a good guess on what the long-term effects will be, but the short-term effects seem pretty, fairly straightforward to game out.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Connor, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And it's been nice having you on.
I'm sorry to end on such a downer note, but I do believe that there's there's still some hope out there that all of us as citizens can and should do more to just look out for our neighbors, wear masks, welcome the immigrant and refugee and displaced person. I've also seen some good bits from Zakaria on why we should be looking to an economic boom as Europe hopefully gets its act together and the US seems ready for an economic takeoff. Actually, I know we started with the World War II. In fact, the US has plowed more money into combating COVID through aid and infrastructure and medical measures than all of, and just in the past year and a half, than all that was spent in World War II, which again is up for debate on how well that money was spent. But you know, depending upon how worried you are about inflation, you know, if you're looking to make a difference just in a more thriving economy and society, get yourself ready for it, and make sure to get involved and make sure to vote when you can. It's, again, think of Afghanistan. It's not something to take for granted or waste, you know, let go to waste. So anyway, thank you so much for having me. I should have said this up front, but as I am a graduate student with a certain university and an employee of a certain government department, my views are not reflective of any official positions they have, although I am grateful and honored to have been welcome aboard there. If anybody winds up cyber stalking me to find out exactly whom I work for and study with. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We'll be in touch.
All right, best wishes. Have a great rest of your weekend, Brandon.
You too.